quick request to the presenters. We are recording this so that people who couldn't attend can view it. And part of that we'll want to make sure that the questions actually get recorded. So if you're a presenter and you're fielding a question, could you please speak the question that was asked over the microphone so that it'll get recorded.
Thank you. Okay, so welcome back from lunch, and we'll begin our afternoon session with Tony Smith and his colleagues from CSIRO in Australia, Hobart. Here you go, Tony.
Thanks, Phil. Okay, so it's always a pleasure to come to Seattle. I'm a reasonably frequent visitor, and thanks very much to the Bevan Foundation and the organisers and so on for giving me another excuse to come here. Also need to acknowledge two sort of primary co-authors, Beth Fulton and Alistair Hobday, a lot of whose work I'll be talking about today. And I've got a much longer list of people who've actually contributed to all this at the end of the talk. Thought what I would do, I prepared this talk obviously ahead, and I haven't changed it at all, but I'm going to try and skim through some bits of it and pick up on a couple of themes that and ideas that came up from several of the talks already this morning, including some of Jake's ideas like the importance of human ecology, step changes in policy, delivering on what we know, using life history information, misses and false alarms, and some of the social, economic and ecological integration. So I'll kind of touch on those as we go along. EBFM has been a sort of an agreed policy goal in fisheries management in Australia for quite a long time. It was one of these step changes that Jake referred to, and that actually very strongly drove. There was that situation that Jake described of not having the scientific tools to actually underpin it. And rather than go away and do 20 years research, what we tried to come up with was to mobilise existing information in ways that could be useful to decision making. And so there was a very strong drive for a sort of a practical implementation of this. And I'm going to talk about some of the tools that were in fact only two main ones that we've developed as part of that sort of journey. I'm also going to focus very much on scientific tools. Nick Rains is giving a presentation later in these proceedings, and he'll talk much more about the management uptake of a lot of this work. Okay, so the outline is that I'm going to talk a little bit about a framework to think about tool development, just a couple of slides on that, but I'll keep coming back to that through the presentation, and a couple of examples, one on ecological risk assessment and another on Atlantis, whose name is actually attributable, I think, back to Billy Christensen. And then I'm going to just finish off with a little bit about what lessons we think we've learned. This is a slide that I often put up, which is just to remind ourselves that fisheries management is an adaptive management process, an adaptive management cycle, and that we've got, monitoring, assessment, decision rules feeding into regulation, the actual fishery, its impacts and so on. And that management strategy evaluation is a scientific tool that essentially models this feedback process, but also that science comes into obviously understanding this connection and also into designing, monitoring and doing assessments. This was the framework slide that I've actually shown before at a couple of meetings, but I think is perhaps worth repeating. And that is that in thinking about the tools, which are tools for management, we already saw on the previous slide, there's monitoring, assessment, MSE, and those can vary in terms of their scope. So some of the work is at the sort of population level, stock assessments and so on. some of it's at the ecosystem level, and some of it's out into the sort of social and economic dynamics. And I guess the really key point of this slide is that the tools themselves, the methods that are used in them, can range from sort of expert opinion through empirical approaches to model-based approaches, and I'm going to illustrate some of that range of methods. This is just an example of an attempt to illustrate that same point for stock assessment, which is an assessment method at population level, and most of it is sort of model-based. So I'm going to start with ecological risk assessment, which is one of the key scientific tools we've developed in support of practical EBFM in Australia, and it really is trying to assess the impacts of fishing on a whole range of species, not just target species, on habitats and on communities. And the particular methodology we came up with is, or group of methods, has this particular acronym here, which stands for ERA, for effects of fishing. This is just another list, so I won't dwell on it, but the sorts of criteria that you want in applying any method, but particularly for ecological risk assessment, the key points down the bottom that no method could possibly meet all these criteria, but nonetheless we struggled on, and this is probably the key slide for this ERAEF approach, and it really, the key point to it is that it's got a hierarchical structure. So what we're interested in is the effects of fishing on, as I said, species, habitats, communities and so on. We look at that at a whole of fishery level, and so there's an initial sort of scoping stage, and then we go through these level 1, level 2, level 3 kind of assessments, almost like a triage approach in a medical context. And these move from qualitative methods, which are essentially expert judgment based, through to model-based approaches at level 3. The point is that we try and be comprehensive at this first level, and therefore our level of analysis is fairly shallow, and we screen out into hazards that are either low or high risk, and those at the high risk we might decide actually go to an immediate risk management response, but if we choose not to do that, then we'll look at those set of hazards at the next level of assessment in a more quantitative way, and similarly at that level there'll be a further screening, and we'll maybe apply some fully model-based or quantitative methods at level 3. In terms of the time and cost of doing that, it's sort of lowest if you can stop at level 1, and gets more expensive and data intensive as you go down. And we also are moving from a sort of a less certain to a more certain kind of analysis. This is just an example, and I'm only going to dwell on these pretty briefly, but an example of a level 2 analysis, which is based around this PSA, which stands for Productivity Susceptibility Analysis. So if you think of a species as having a certain level of productivity, where it goes from high here to low here, and then the susceptibility to a particular fishery goes from low to high, then down this end you've got low risk species that have high productivity and low susceptibility, and conversely high risk up there. And this is a way of rapidly screening lots and lots of species. So the way in which we assess productivity is through a series of essentially life history attributes, which is the point Jake made this morning, that we can make good use of readily available information. And then the susceptibility comes from actually a product of these sort of factors, such as availability, which is spatial overlap, encounterability, selectivity, and then we also take account of post-capture mortality. And so what we can do is rapidly screen and assess quite large numbers of, say, bycatch species for a particular fishery, and they'll fall out on this sort of PSA plot, and that allows us to concentrate on, say, this group of species up here for sort of further analysis or maybe for risk management. We've actually developed very similar approaches for habitats. I'm not even going to attempt to describe those, but I can provide sort of background reports and so on some of these methods for people that are interested. And we've also developed, or in the process of developing, similar sort of analyses at the community level. This is just an example of around Australia how we're using sort of bioregional assessment approaches to look at different regions and then different, say, depth zones within regions and so on. This is just one quick example of some output across different fisheries of essentially a risk profile. So the x-axis here is overall risk from a PSA analysis. There's just frequency, number of species at different levels of risk for 3 different types of fishery: purse seine, trawl and pelagic longline. And you can see there's a different risk profile. The interesting thing being that the trawl fishery, even though it has many more species in it, the range is similar in terms of risk levels to the pelagic longline, but the overall mean risk, if you like, is somewhat different. And that's basically because pelagic longline bycatch takes a lot of species that are generally higher in the food chain, so less productive, I guess. And so this again is a kind of a summary slide that says that we go from fishing activities through focusing on these different components of the ecosystem, where the level 1 analysis, which I haven't really described, again there's a risk axis along here. If the risk is below a certain threshold, say here, nothing came out in the bycatch above this threshold, then we don't do any further analysis. If it's above, then we go to a PSA analysis. PSA analysis, we again narrow down the sort of focus and range, to go to some sort of quantitative analysis at the 3rd level. So it's just an efficient way of sort of assessing and screening lots of entities. We've actually applied this to over 20 of the federally managed fisheries. We've assessed several thousand species, hundreds of habitat types, currently developing some rapid level 3 assessment methods that actually estimate fishing mortality directly from very limited data, mainly, and also reference points which are based mainly on life history information, and the F's based on distributional overlap of species and fisheries. So back to our sort of 3D slide of tools. So ERA is an assessment method, so it fits here. It's been used to go from sort of population species analyses out to ecosystems, and in terms of the method, it's gone from sort of expert through empirical to model-based sort of method. So it's starting to fill in some of that sort of 3-dimensional space of tools that we're interested in having available to implement EBFM. So I'm now going to move on to whole of fishery management strategy evaluation, MSE, which is basically about trying to use whole of system understanding on fisheries management systems, social and economic behaviour. We've seen some slides already where these sort of these elements overlap within a formal evaluation sort of approach to look at strategies at the sort of level of ecosystem-based fisheries management. I'm going to talk about one particular case example, which is a southeast fishery in southern and eastern Australia. Covers a very large area. It goes from subtropical down to subantarctic sort of ecosystems, from inshore to offshore, highly species diverse and lots of gears, as you'll see in a minute. So it's a fairly complicated sort of fishery. basically this project was about rethinking the management arrangements for this fishery, which had been under quota management pretty much solely for a number of years. The project was about trying to engage stakeholders and bring them along in terms of thinking about changing the management of the fishery. And we actually had two phases, a qualitative phase, which I'll describe briefly, which was based on expert judgment, and then a quantitative phase using the Atlantis modelling approach. The qualitative phase basically involved pulling together an expert team that collectively had about 150 years or more experience in that particular fishery.
600.
Sorry?
It's only about 6 people, isn't it?
Yeah, something like that. Well, it included Terry Walker, so he accounted for and then we actually involved stakeholders in quite an active way, actually in designing the sort of strategies that we were going to evaluate. And that proved to be quite an interesting process in itself. They were initially quite uncertain and almost reluctant about it. But we basically said, don't worry about practicality, just think of the best ideas you can come up with for how to manage this fishery. And we came up with a pretty interesting range of strategies, and they got very enthusiastic about it. We did still use a formal MSE structure, so we formally defined alternative strategies. We had multiple objectives that were also discussed and agreed with the stakeholders, and performance measures related to them. We actually went through a process of predicting the consequences under each strategy for each of the performance measures and then evaluating the trade-offs. We got, because it was an expert sort of qualitative approach, rapid results, and actually proved to be a major catalyst for change in the fishery. So early on in the process we came up with what we called a blue skies option, which was one of these sort of far off, sort of at the time, left field options, which partly as a result, not only, but partly as a result of this sort of process and project, I think, has since become pretty much business as usual in the fishery. So that was the qualitative phase. Quantitative phase actually used this Atlantis model, which I've got probably too many slides here, so I'm going to skip through a number of those. But basically, it's an ecosystem model that's built into an MSE framework that allows modelling of monitoring, assessment, decision making, and then most particularly a lot of social and economic dynamics that actually drives the behaviour of fishing fleets that interacts with the ecosystem. And again, it's a classical MSE analysis where we have, say, a number of strategies and a number of performance measures, and we're looking at trade-offs in that sort of space. So there's I'll skip these pretty quickly, but there's a spatial structure, 3D, in fact, spatial structure associated with the model. Lots of sort of biophysical elements, including different bottom types and sort of geographic features, linked to oceanographic models, blue link in this case, with sort of 3D currents and temperature, salinity, eddies and things like that. There's a, of course, being an ecosystem model, fairly, go back one, the usual array of elements of the ecosystem, including some sort of target species, but also some groups of species and invertebrates and so on. We did quite a lot of calibration on this model before we used it. In terms of fishing fleets, there's a very large number in southeastern Australia, and they're all represented in some way, although the dynamic fleets were more those in the Commonwealth fishery. We've got, as I said, quite a lot of focus on social and economic drivers of behaviour in the fishing fleet, and quite a strong focus on behavioural uncertainty, which is, I think in most cases, sort of ignored in these kind of modelling exercises. Quite a lot of modelling of behaviour in terms of things like quota trading, investment and disinvestment, and also a focus on the costs of management, including compliance research and monitoring and so on. The management levers, there's a broad range of those, from gear controls, spatial zoning, discarding rules, quotas and so on, actually modelling different levels of compliance. And decision rules are modelled in various ways, from sort of modelling the effects of lobbying and political processes through to formal harvest strategies. These were some of the scenarios we evaluated. There were actually more of them, and again, I won't dwell on the detail of any of this, but just to say that it's always good to have a sort of a status quo kind of strategy in there to compare other things to. We went from that to things like an extreme quota management system, a bit like New Zealand perhaps has, an integrated management across multiple sort of bigger levers, conservation-driven option, and some other ones. And the way the results were presented were not nearly as nice as Billy showed us this morning, but basically kite diagrams with broad, these indicators or performance measures, if you like, are actually amalgams of multiple indicators themselves, where we had sort of social management, industry, ecological, economic, management costs and so on. And then you can start to look at the trade-offs across these different objectives of different strategies. So, just very quickly, the comparison of the qualitative and quantitative approaches to MSE. We used exactly the same formal MSE structure, but different methods for the prediction, obviously. There was actually about 80% plus agreement on the trends in the indicators between those two approaches, and actually the same ranking of options across strategies, which was quite interesting. The qualitative predictions missed a few key aspects, and particularly some of the behavioural responses to changes in regulation. But nonetheless, the qualitative approach seemed to work pretty well. Whether that was a function of who we had on the group and so on, it's a bit hard to say, I guess. But we've repeated that qualitative method in a couple of other fisheries, and I think reasonably successfully. So back to the diagram. So now we're in an MSE phase of the types of tools. We're moving right through population ecosystems and out into the social economic dynamics. And in particular instance, we've got, in terms of methods, a sort of an expert-based method and a model-based method. So again, you can start to see ways in which this set of potential tools is sort of getting filled out. So overall lessons is the last slide. Basically, we'd argue that you actually need quite a broad range of tools and a toolbox for addressing EBFM, and you need different tools fit for different purposes and different circumstances. Just a bit of an aside, one of the key issues both in the ecological risk assessment and in the modelling is data access and management, which can be a major hindrance. Actually just getting, making available the information we have is often one of the biggest challenges in these sort of things. Nick will presumably talk perhaps a bit more about this, but there's been pretty good uptake. In fact, part of the discussion so far has been, well, there's quite a lot of science done, how much uptake is there? I think both in the ERA there's been good uptake, with certainly at the Commonwealth level, and with the MSE work, again, it's not really gone to inform tactical decisions like setting quotas, but it's definitely informed some of those broader, how do we manage a system like this and how do we meet broader ecosystem objectives. So I think it's been not too bad from that point of view. I'd say we still lack some of the economic and social impact assessment tools, so that's an area where further work would be required. In terms of sort of where to now, I'm probably not sure how I'm going for time, but okay, 5 minutes? Yeah. All right, so this issue of building proportion into assessments, I was going to pick up a little bit on some of your discussions about hits and misses and so on. Jake, one of the things we did with the ecological risk assessment approach was, as we're going down those various levels, we basically took a very precautionary approach to assessment at level 1. So we don't have much information, we're very uncertain, so we tended to take a sort of plausible worst case scenario analysis to assessing risk, and then as we get more, perhaps more quantitative, or at least not necessarily more quantitative, but just more information, we drop back to a much more sort of neutral view. One of the consequences of that is that it actually provides a built-in incentive for getting more information and better information. But it does mean that certainly if you stop at those earlier levels, they're highly risk averse in the sense of they're aimed very much at not getting false negatives or misses, but they result in a lot of false alarms or positives. And so there's kind of a trade-off in that space. There's another issue that seems to crop up fairly frequently, whether we can provide scientific advice on ecological objectives, and perhaps particularly those sort of tipping points and limit reference points and so on. I think there's more work to be done there, particularly when we get away from species and so on. But this, how to predict human behavioural responses, we see as really key. Beth's and my and other people involved in the Atlantis modelling conclusion was it's actually modelling ecosystems is pretty easy. Modelling human behaviour is the real challenge. And then what this is all about is really trying to identify whole management systems that are robust to uncertainties, and noting, as has been stated by several speakers already, that trade-offs are inevitable and that you do end up having to make some choices. So that's a further list of some of the folks involved, both in the ERA work and some of our international collaborators, some of whom are here in the room, on the Atlantis modelling in particular, and some of the people in AFMA and in the Southeast Fishery who are involved in that qualitative modelling MSc work that I spoke about.
Time for a couple of questions for Tony.
Yeah, you sort of passed, well, two questions, maybe they're related. The first one is, you had a slide that said we've evaluated 20 fisheries and 2,000 species and hundreds of habitats. Working here in the US, that would mean a document about 3 times the size of this building. For the staff, perhaps 4 or 5 times the size of the Alaska Fisheries Science Center. Clearly you've got a process, which you didn't quite get into, of how